Bully terrorized teachers, one slap changed his life forever. A story by Heartfelt Tales. The sound echoed through the hallway like a gunshot. Silence fell over the crowded corridor as 30 pairs of teenage eyes turned toward the source of the sharp crack that had just shattered the morning chaos. There, standing in the doorway of room 204, was Ms. Sarah Chen, all 5 feet 2 inches of her, with her hands still raised and her usually gentle brown eyes blazing with an intensity that no one had ever seen before. The towering figure of Jake Morrison, the school's most notorious bully, stood frozen with his hand pressed against his reddening cheek, his mouth agape in complete disbelief. What led to this moment would change not just these 2 lives, but the entire culture of Lincoln High School forever. But to understand the power of that single slap, we need to go back to where it all began. If you're enjoying this story of transformation and courage, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and don't forget to subscribe to Heartfelt Tales for more inspiring stories that touch the soul. Your support means the world to us, and now, let's dive into Sarah's incredible journey, ***. 3 months earlier, Sarah Chen had walked through the doors of Lincoln High School carrying nothing but a worn leather briefcase, a heart full of hope, and the naive belief that kindness could conquer all. Fresh out of teacher training, she had specifically requested to work at Lincoln despite its reputation as one of the most challenging schools in the district. Her colleagues had warned her about the school's problems, the high dropout rate, the violence, the complete lack of respect for authority, but Sarah believed that every child deserved a chance, no matter how lost they seemed. Her first day had been a baptism by fire. The moment she introduced herself to her sophomore English class, she could sense the predatory energy in the room. The students sized her up like wolves evaluating prey, looking for weakness, testing boundaries. At the center of it all sat Jake Morrison, a 6-foot-tall 17-year-old who had been held back twice and ruled the school through fear and intimidation. His cold blue eyes had locked onto hers with a smirk that said he had already decided she wouldn't last a week. Jake wasn't just any bully. He was the kind of teenager who had learned early that the world was cruel and had decided to be cruel right back. His father had abandoned the family when Jake was 8, leaving his mother to work 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. Jake had raised himself on the streets, building walls of aggression around a heart that had been broken too many times to count. School was his kingdom, and he protected his throne with ruthless efficiency. For weeks, Sarah tried everything she had learned in her training. She attempted to connect with Jake through literature, thinking that perhaps the stories of overcoming adversity might resonate with him. She stayed after school to offer extra help, hoping to show him that someone cared about his future. She even called his mother, only to discover that the woman was too exhausted and overwhelmed to deal with her son's problems. Every kindness Sarah extended was met with increased hostility, every gentle word twisted into a weapon against her. The harassment escalated gradually. It started with Jake talking during her lessons, his voice deliberately loud enough to disrupt the entire class. When she asked him to stop, he would flash that cold smile and apologize in a mocking tone that made it clear he had no intention of changing. Then came the accidents, papers knocked off her desk, books dropped loudly during quiet reading time, chairs scraped against the floor whenever she tried to speak. But Jake was smart. He never crossed the line enough to warrant serious disciplinary action. He understood the system well enough to know exactly how far he could push without facing real consequences. He had perfected the art of psychological warfare, death by 1,000 cuts that slowly wore down his victims until they simply gave up. The other students watched this daily torture with a mixture of fear and fascination. Some felt sorry for Ms. Chen, but none dared to defend her. Jake's influence extended far beyond the classroom. He had connections with older students, some who had already graduated but still hung around the school like vultures. To cross Jake meant risking not just verbal abuse but potential physical violence that could follow you home. Sarah's fellow teachers noticed her deteriorating condition. The bright-eyed optimist who had started the year with such enthusiasm was becoming withdrawn and exhausted. She stopped eating lunch in the faculty lounge, instead staying in her classroom to grade papers and avoid the pitying looks of her colleagues. Her lesson plans, once creative and engaging, became mechanical and uninspired. She was surviving rather than teaching, and everyone knew it. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in November. Sarah had spent the weekend preparing a special lesson on empathy and human connection, desperately hoping to reach her students through a powerful short story about a young man who overcame his troubled past. She had stayed up until 2 in the morning perfecting her presentation, convinced that if she could just find the right words, the right approach, she could break through Jake's defenses. The lesson began well enough. Even Jake seemed to be paying attention as Sarah read the opening paragraphs of the story. For a moment, she felt a flicker of hope. Then, just as she reached the story's emotional climax, Jake stood up and began a slow, mocking clap. "Wow, Ms. Chen," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "That's really touching. Almost made me cry." His followers laughed on cue, and Sarah felt her carefully constructed lesson crumbling around her. But she pressed on, her voice shaking slightly as she tried to redirect the class back to the story's themes. "Jake, I think if you gave this a chance, you might find something meaningful in." "Meaningful?" Jake interrupted, his voice rising. "You want to know what's meaningful? I'll tell you what's meaningful." He walked to the front of the class, towering over Sarah's small frame. "What's meaningful is that you're just another privileged little girl who thinks she can save the world with her bedtime stories. You don't know anything about real life, about what it's like to be hungry, to have your lights turned off, to have your dad walk out and never come back." The class fell silent. Even Jake's usual supporters seemed uncomfortable with how far he was pushing. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Not here. Not in front of them. You think you understand us," Jake continued, his voice now barely above a whisper but somehow more menacing than his shouting. "But you're just a tourist in our world. When things get too hard, you'll pack up your little briefcase and go find some nice suburban school where the kids say, 'Please,' and 'Thank you,' and pretend to care about your stupid lessons." Something inside Sarah snapped. Not because of what Jake had said about her, but because of what he had revealed about himself. In his cruel words, she heard the pain of a broken child who had learned to hurt others before they could hurt him. She saw the defensive walls he had built so high that he couldn't even see over them anymore. And in that moment, she realized that all her gentle approaches had been interpreted as weakness, all her kindness seen as manipulation. The slap came without conscious thought. Her hand moved faster than her mind, driven by months of frustration and a sudden, crystal-clear understanding of what needed to happen. The sound cracked through the air like a whip, and Jake stumbled backward, his hand flying to his cheek. The silence that followed was deafening. 30 teenagers sat frozen, hardly daring to breathe. Sarah stood there, her hand still raised, her chest heaving with emotion. But there was no regret in her eyes, no fear of consequences. For the first time in months, she felt completely in control. "Sit down," she said, her voice calm but carrying an authority that no one had ever heard from her before. Jake, still holding his cheek, stared at her in shock. "I said sit down." Slowly, like a robot following programming, Jake returned to his seat. Sarah walked to the front of the class and faced them all, her small frame somehow seeming to fill the entire room. "You want to know about real life, Jake?" she said, her voice steady and strong. "Let me tell you about real life. Real life is my mother working 16-hour days in a factory so I could go to college. Real life is eating ramen noodles for dinner every night for 2 years so I could afford my teaching certification. Real life is coming to this school every day knowing that students like you will try to break me down, and choosing to stay anyway because I believe in something bigger than my own comfort." She paused, letting her words sink in. Jake's usual smirk had vanished, replaced by something that looked almost like fear, not of her, but of what she was saying. "You think pain makes you special, Jake? You think having a hard life gives you the right to make everyone else's life harder? I've got news for you, everyone in this room has a story. Everyone has been hurt, disappointed, let down by the people who were supposed to protect them. The difference is that most of these kids haven't used their pain as an excuse to become cruel." Sarah walked over to Jake's desk and leaned down so that only he could hear her next words. "That slap wasn't about anger, Jake. It was about respect. You've been testing everyone around you, pushing and pushing to see who would finally push back. Well, congratulations, you found someone who won't break. But more importantly, you found someone who sees right through your act." She straightened up and addressed the entire class. "I know what you're all thinking. You're thinking Ms. Chen finally lost it. You're thinking I'm going to get fired, and you're probably right. But before that happens, I want you to understand something. That slap wasn't about violence. It was about boundaries. It was about saying enough to behavior that we've all been enabling by staying silent." The bell rang, but nobody moved. Sarah gathered her materials and walked toward the door, then turned back to face the class one final time. "Jake, I'll be here after school if you want to talk. Not as a teacher trying to save a troubled student, but as one human being to another. The choice is yours." And with that, she left. The hallway erupted in whispers and speculation. Word of the incident spread through the school like wildfire. By lunch, everyone knew that quiet little Ms. Chen had slapped Jake Morrison and lived to tell about it. The reactions were mixed. Some students cheered, having waited years for someone to stand up to the school's most notorious bully. Others were shocked that a teacher would resort to physical confrontation. But everyone agreed on one thing: Sarah Chen was nothing like they had thought. As expected, Sarah was called to the principal's office within the hour. Principal Williams, a tired-looking man in his 50s who had been fighting losing battles at Lincoln High for over a decade, sat across from her with a heavy sigh. "Sarah, you know I have to suspend you pending an investigation," he said, his voice carrying no satisfaction in delivering the news. "What you did was completely against policy, regardless of the circumstances." "I know," Sarah replied calmly. "I'm prepared for the consequences. Can you tell me what happened? In your own words?" Sarah recounted the morning's events without trying to justify or excuse her actions. She spoke honestly about the months of harassment, about her failed attempts to connect with Jake, and about the moment when something inside her had simply said, "Enough." Principal Williams listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on his pad. When she finished, he set down his pen and looked at her with something that might have been admiration. "You know, Sarah, in all my years in education, I've never seen a teacher slap a student. I've seen teachers quit, transfer, have nervous breakdowns, but never this. Part of me wants to condemn what you did, but another part of me, well, let's just say Jake Morrison has needed someone to draw a line for a very long time. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the courtyard where students were eating lunch. "I'll have to follow protocol, but I want you to know that Jake's mother has been called. She's coming in this afternoon. This might be the wake-up call that family needs." That afternoon, as Sarah cleaned out her desk, she heard a soft knock on her classroom door. She looked up to see Jake standing in the doorway, his usual aggressive posture replaced by something more vulnerable. "Miss Chen? You said I could come talk to you." Sarah gestured to the chair across from her desk. Jake sat down, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. "My mom's here," he said quietly. "She's crying. I haven't seen her cry since my dad left." Sarah waited, sensing that Jake needed time to find his words. "I want to hate you for what you did," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't. Because for the first time in years, someone actually saw me. Not the tough guy act, not the bully everyone's afraid of. You saw the scared kid underneath all that anger." Tears began to roll down Jake's cheeks, and he made no attempt to wipe them away. "I don't know how to be anything else. I've been angry for so long, I don't remember what it feels like to be anything else." Sarah reached across the desk and placed her hand gently on his arm. "Jake, that slap wasn't the end of your story. It was the beginning of a new chapter. But you have to choose to write it." Over the next hour, Jake told Sarah things he had never told anyone. About the nights he went to bed hungry because his mother couldn't afford groceries. About the constant fear that they would lose their apartment. About the rage that consumed him every time he saw other kids with fathers, with families that weren't falling apart. About the way he had learned to hurt others before they could hurt him. Sarah listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that helped Jake dig deeper into his feelings. She shared some of her own struggles, the poverty she had grown up with, the times she had felt powerless and alone. Slowly, Jake began to understand that his pain, while real and valid, didn't have to define him. When Jake's mother arrived, Sarah was struck by how young she looked, how exhausted and overwhelmed. The three of them sat together in the empty classroom, and for the first time in years, Jake and his mother really talked. They talked about his father's abandonment, about the financial struggles, about the anger that had been poisoning their relationship for years. It wasn't a magical moment of instant healing. There were tears, raised voices, and years of hurt that couldn't be undone with a single conversation. But it was a beginning. It was the first time Jake had let his guard down in front of his mother, and the first time she had seen past his anger to the frightened boy beneath. Sarah's suspension lasted 2 weeks, during which time something extraordinary happened at Lincoln High School. The story of the slap had spread far beyond the school walls, but more importantly, it had started conversations among the students about bullying, about standing up for what's right, about the difference between enabling bad behavior and truly helping someone. A group of students organized a petition to bring Ms. Chen back, gathering over 500 signatures from students, parents, and even some faculty members. They wrote letters to the school board describing how Sarah's unconventional moment of truth had accomplished more in 5 minutes than years of traditional disciplinary measures. Jake himself became the most unlikely advocate for Sarah's return. He wrote a letter to the principal, taking full responsibility for his behavior and explaining how Sarah's actions had forced him to confront truths about himself that he had been avoiding for years. He also began meeting with the school counselor, working on anger management and developing healthier ways to cope with his emotions. The school board meeting to decide Sarah's fate was packed with supporters. Students who had never spoken up before stood at the podium to share their stories about bullying, about feeling powerless, about watching Ms. Chen suffer in silence for months before finally saying enough was enough. Jake's testimony was the most powerful. Standing before the board, this young man who had terrorized teachers and students alike spoke with a maturity and insight that surprised everyone. "Ms. Chen didn't slap me because she was angry," he said, his voice steady and clear. "She slapped me because she cared enough to risk her career to save me from myself. That slap woke me up from a nightmare I'd been living in for years. It forced me to look in the mirror and see what I had become. And for the first time in my life, I didn't like what I saw." He paused, looking directly at the board members. "I know what Ms. Chen did was against the rules. But sometimes the rules aren't enough. Sometimes it takes something shocking to break through years of pain and anger. Ms. Chen saw a drowning boy and threw him a life preserver, even though she knew it might cost her everything." The board's decision was unanimous. Sarah would be reinstated with a formal reprimand and mandatory participation in conflict resolution training. More importantly, the incident sparked a school-wide initiative to address bullying and create better support systems for both students and teachers. When Sarah returned to Lincoln High, she found a transformed environment. Jake had not only stopped his bullying behavior but had become a peer mediator, helping other students work through their conflicts. The respect she had earned through her moment of courage had given her a platform to implement the changes she had always dreamed of making. Her English classes became forums for honest discussion about real issues. Students who had never engaged before began participating, sharing their own stories of struggle and triumph. The walls that had existed between teacher and student began to crumble, replaced by mutual respect and genuine caring. Jake's transformation was perhaps the most remarkable of all. The angry young man who had once ruled through fear became a leader in a different way. He started a support group for students from broken homes, sharing his own experiences and helping others find healthier ways to cope with their pain. His grades improved dramatically, and for the first time in years, he began to envision a future beyond high school. The relationship between Jake and Sarah evolved into something neither had expected. She became not just his teacher but his mentor, helping him navigate the challenging process of changing his life. He learned to channel his intensity into positive pursuits, eventually becoming the student council president and leading anti-bullying initiatives throughout the district. Years later, when Jake graduated as valedictorian and headed off to college on a full scholarship, he would credit that slap as the moment his real life began. Not because violence had solved his problems, but because someone had finally cared enough to refuse to enable his self-destructive behavior. Sarah's story became legendary in education circles, not as an endorsement of physical discipline, but as a testament to the power of authentic human connection. She had shown that sometimes love looks like kindness, and sometimes it looks like drawing a firm line in the sand. The key was knowing the difference and having the courage to act when action was needed. The slap heard around Lincoln High School lasted only a second, but its impact echoed for years. It taught everyone who witnessed it that true strength isn't about being the toughest or the loudest. It's about being willing to take a stand for what's right, even when that stand comes at great personal cost. Sarah Chen never slapped another student. She never needed to. The respect she earned in that moment of courage became the foundation for a teaching career that would inspire thousands of students over the decades that followed. She had learned that sometimes the most profound acts of love require the most difficult choices, and that real change often begins with a single moment of truth. Jake Morrison went on to become a social worker, dedicating his life to helping other troubled youth find their way. He never forgot the teacher who refused to give up on him, who saw past his anger to the frightened boy beneath. And he never forgot the lesson that pain doesn't have to be permanent, that everyone deserves a second chance, and that sometimes the people who challenge us the most are the ones who change us the most. The story of the slap that changed everything became a reminder that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they're 5'2" teachers with worn leather briefcases and hearts big enough to risk everything for a student who desperately needs someone to believe in them. Sometimes they're the courage to say no to behavior that everyone else has accepted as normal. And sometimes they're the wisdom to know that true compassion isn't always comfortable, but it's always worth it. This story of courage and transformation reminds us that sometimes the most powerful changes begin with a single moment of truth. If this tale of Ms. Chen and Jake's journey touched your heart, please show your support by giving this video a thumbs up and sharing it with others who might need to hear this message of hope and redemption. Don't forget to subscribe to Heartfelt Tales and hit the notification bell so you never miss our inspiring stories that celebrate the resilience of the human spirit. Your comments and engagement help us continue bringing these meaningful tales to life. Thank you for being part of our community, and remember, sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of courage, ***.